Welcome to the IND podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and continue following the major developments that are occurring in the world today. Now, our major focus has and will continue to be on Ukraine. Our story today is going to primarily focus on the Russian convoy and the increased attacks by the Russian military against Ukrainian civilian targets, particularly the Freedom Square in Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, and one of Kyiv's major radio broadcasting towers. But first, let's just cover some basic and major developments that have occurred in the war so far. Now, the fighting has been occurring for 6 days and has devastated many parts of Ukraine, causing more than 500,000 people to seek refuge in other countries. Countless other civilians are seeking shelter underground, in bomb shelters, underground garages, or gigantic basements of residential buildings. Now, in addition to this, the effect on Russia has also been massive. Russia has essentially become an international pariah, and this status is only increasing on a daily basis. Essentially, the only allies or countries that are willing to cooperate with Russia that are currently left as this invasion continues right now are Belarus, North Korea, and China, leaving the Russian Federation with very little diplomatic and international options, both economically and politically speaking. On a political note, Ukraine and the President Volodymyr Zelensky have made a formal application to join the European Union, which has been positively received by the EU. Now, the reality is that Ukraine will not be joining the European Union anytime soon. This is a large process with a lot of requirements and prerequisites to be made before any nation can enter. Nonetheless, it is a symbolic message that shows that Ukraine is not giving in and will continue to act on its own right of self-determination and pull itself towards what it feels it identifies with, being the West. Now we're going to focus on the two major things of our story today. The massive Russian convoy that is 40 miles long, filled with tanks and other armored vehicles heading towards the center of the capital city, Kyiv, and the increased amount of Russian attacks on residential and civilian targets. Now let's begin on the bombardments and the increased attacks on civilian and residential targets. In the beginning of the war, Russia made it very clear that it was only targeting legitimate military assets, resources, and targets. Now, this has actually been genuinely true. Russian attacks have been focused on military bases, and it actually seemed that Putin's intention of invading Ukraine, which was stated as the demilitarization of the country, seemed to be legitimate. However, after these 6 days of what is the largest ground war in European history since World War II, Russia has been slowed down massively, facing gigantic resistance on the ground that has been estimated to cost more than 5,000 Russian lives, with countless other Russian soldiers being captured and held in Ukrainian military custody as we speak right now. Additionally, in most wars, when a large great power invades a smaller nation, they're typically able to very, very quickly, because of superior air dominance technology, fighter jets, and other resources, assert air dominance. Russia notably has failed to do so, even so far. And this has caused Russia to step back and begin to change its tactics. Now, what we are seeing is an increase of Russian bombardments, missile strikes, and artillery strikes on residential buildings, hospitals, schools, and other civilian targets. Now, the vast majority of civilians in Ukraine are currently seeking shelter, those that haven't left at least. And it's estimated by the United Nations that 136 civilians have died in the fighting so far, though this number is probably higher. Nonetheless, the vast majority of civilians are actually safe, and it should be noted that typically before Russia carries out a major airstrike or offensive that is targeting any ground targets, it calls for those civilians in that area to leave. Nonetheless, Russian missile attacks and targets have stopped just attacking legitimate military resources and targets. Now, the reason why is if you look at Russia's military history, particularly its invasions and offensives in Chechnya and Syria, one of its main initial attacks or forms of utilization of military resources has been relentless bombardments on every single target it can manage, military or otherwise. Now, the reason for this is actually legitimate. It is done to destroy cities and make it much, much harder for an insurgency to rise up, and two, to destroy the spirit of the people and those fighting. Now, the reality is Russia has been a little reserved on actually using this tactic in Ukraine. There are many reasons for this, though my honest opinion is that the world seems to sympathize significantly more with Ukraine than other countries or regions that have been invaded by Russia, such as Chechnya, Syria, or Georgia. Now, the reason why, probably, and it's sad to say this, but it's true, is because Ukraine is European. When many people in the Western world who are white and come from a European origin look at the white European people in Ukraine, they feel significant more sympathy towards them than they would Arabs, Africans, or other ethnic groups. That is a sad reality, but it just is one. Because of this, Russia has been more reserved to use these kinds of tactics. Nonetheless, major Russian losses and the fact that the invasion has not gone as swiftly, nearly as swiftly or successfully as planned by Russian forces, has forced the Russian military to look at other tactics. Now, this has caused a massive humanitarian crisis. While the amount of civilian deaths isn't exactly known, the reality is many other indirect effects of these bombardments have already been seen. Hospitals have had to move their wards, care wards, even maternity wards, from the actual hospitals into underground bunkers, where notably it is much more difficult to provide medical services, care, or operate in these bunkers, making the receivement of medical care much more difficult for the people of Ukraine. Obviously, it is a war. Now, the most major effect has been the bombardments on general infrastructure, which provides Ukrainians with electricity and different utilities. Most notably, water pipes and filters have been bombed out, which has caused more than hundreds of thousands of families to be left without clean or secure water. This is quickly turning into a, right now, minor, but it soon will be major humanitarian crisis for the Ukrainians seeking shelter that are currently still in the country. Now, this is something that still needs to be viewed, watched, and monitored. Many Ukrainian NGOs, the government, and other international groups operating within the country have been commendably documenting every single Russian bombing and taking evidence to provide to eventual war crimes tribunals and courts. And finally, it should be noted that the use of so-called cluster bombs, which typically are weapons that cause massive civilian damage and are not acceptable to use in modern-day warfare, have been allegedly utilized by Russia. Now, some NGOs and the government of Ukraine claim they have evidence of this, though that has not been clarified yet. I'm going to openly say that they probably have used cluster bombs. If this is confirmed, and if Russia's actions against residential and civilian targets are continued to be seen, it's only going to isolate Russia further. Now, this international isolation, which, as I stated before, has caused Russia to only have 3 allies and essentially become an international pariah, only having friends, including Belarus, China, and North Korea, and that being about it, have seemed not to faze Russia as of yet. Now, the economic effects of the sanctions and this international cutoff have had massive effects on the Russian people. But the government of the nation, that government that is under the direction of Vladimir Putin, seems to not be budging and is only antagonizing the West even further, stating that the Western world, pretty much now the entire world's international economic war against the country, could turn into an actual war. Keep in mind, this comes just days after Russia put its nuclear armaments on high alert, which is a chilling perspective to think about. Russia is is undeterred by these sanctions, but they will continue, and the isolation is going to press the Russian public and eventually the Russian government into making some fundamental changes. Now, let's focus on what is on everyone's mind regarding this invasion and what has been the major center of the mainstream media, and I have to concentrate on as well because it is extremely important, is the large Russian convoy that is 40 miles long, consisting of tanks and other armored vehicles, heading towards Kyiv. Now, the convoy is making persistent, though extremely slow, progress. It should be noted that the convoy is only 17 miles away from the center of Ukraine, according to satellite imagery. Now, it's believed that the convoy has been bogged down heavily. Many Ukrainians, the military, militias, and just civilians are using any resources they can to stop this convoy. And so far, it's been slowing it down. In addition to this, Russian soldiers and the convoy and all of Russia's military forces have kind of taken a step back to regroup and figure out how they can regain momentum in this invasion. Russia notably has, from an objective perspective, been losing its attack, and it has not been going as planned. But at the beginning of the invasion, Russia had a significant amount of momentum, and it's trying to recapture this brief momentum that it had in the beginning. But nonetheless, this convoy doesn't seem like the way to do it. We're talking about 40 miles of massive military resources, tanks and armored vehicles, parked and driving next to one another, cramped completely. And anyone that's driven through any European country, especially those in Eastern Europe, knows that the roads are extremely narrow. This convoy is shoulder to shoulder on very narrow roads. It is the perfect military target for the Ukrainian military and militias. It's wide open to missile attacks, artillery attacks, airstrikes, anything you can imagine. Now, the Ukrainian military and militia forces and the rest of the resistance fighters fighting against this invasion are going to utilize this against Russia. But this shows that the Russian military is undeterred by the fact. And honestly, I think that the Russian government and military leadership does not care about casualties on their own end. This convoy is so large that Ukrainian attacks, even if they are extensive, are still going to leave a significant amount of tanks and armored vehicles able to attack the capital city of Kyiv. Now, that's going to be a major loss for Russia, but it's still going to be able to pierce into the heart of the city. Now, some people have said that this is a distraction. I actually don't think it is. I believe that this is a full frontal planned assault on Kyiv. The only distraction that eventually is going on is Russia's targeting of the second largest city, Kharkiv, which I believe is being intentionally done to pull away Ukrainian soldiers defending the capital city to go defend Kharkiv instead. Now, both cities are strategically speaking equally important. However, if Kyiv falls, it will have a much larger impact on morale and the feeling of Ukrainian civilians and the willingness to fight this war against Russia. And I think that the major message of this report today has to be that Russia's focus has changed from taking out military targets to taking out the spirit of the Ukrainian people. Now, for those supporting Ukraine, hopefully that this spirit does not die down and that they're able to keep resisting. The convoy is a major target. Even if it does get into Kyiv, the Ukrainian military and militia groups should take full advantage of this, putting as many traps and as many obstacles in its way while targeting it with relentless missile fire and other forms of rockets or artillery to take out as many vehicles as it can. To, at the very least, if their spirit is going to be attacked, pierce the spirit and morale of Russian soldiers who have been facing major losses. Let me know what you think in the comments. What do you think about the convoy? And do you think Russia is committing war crimes? I notably did not go so far as to state that, and I'm not saying that they're not. I'm not saying that they are. However, when there's enough evidence, this will be seen. Let me know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Join our growing international community. I'll see you tomorrow.